I am not like a single change agent person. I don't know if there are many people out there like that. And even if you have that sort of like creative guru status, I mean, you could be Rick Rubin and walk into some of these companies and like you will have no ability to persuade people, unless there's someone at the top going, oh yeah, like Rick Rubin knows what the fuck he's talking about.
You're listening to Creative Leadership with Heart, a podcast that inspires people to take action and be the leader they were born to be. I'm Coach Rico, and I'm known for coaching and training executives, leaders, founders, and high performers at Fortune 100 businesses, startups, and more. I'm a 20-year creative executive, leadership and life coach, author, speaker, and serial entrepreneur. I'm here to answer your questions about leadership and personal development while also asking you questions that can unlock your untapped potential. What's up, everybody? Thanks for joining us again for another episode of Creative Leadership with Heart. Today, we got David Kim. He is currently the Executive Creative Director at Postmates by Uber. We had a stint together at Netflix. He also worked at Argonaut, Deutsche LA. He had an amazing agency career that transitioned into client-side tech. So yeah, David, welcome to the show.
Hey there, Rico.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. So just jumping right in, tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey as a creative. What was it that as a kid you decided this is what I want to do?
Yeah. So starting from the very, very beginning, I grew up in LA as an immigrant kid, and I think I was always intrigued by the entertainment industry. It's sort of all around you, um, and uh, and I think that sort of just got me into just like being a pop culture junkie. I watched a ton of films. The TV was my default babysitter. Music was a big part of my life. And so I knew that I just wanted to be, you know, in an adjacent industry, if not that industry itself. So I've like worked at record labels. I worked for Francis Ford Coppola's production company. I was taking all these little jobs through high school and college just to expose myself to the industry. And, you know, I think eventually I kind of stumbled into like marketing and advertising because it was basically a way to make a living, using the skills and sort of passions that I had for like, you know, cultural things, like making film and like using music and all this. And that's sort of informed my approach to like how to solve problems, creatively, which ultimately is like what I've made a career out of. All that said, like my background, like in terms of studying and training, was very academic. So on the flip side, like on the one hand, I had this very strong creative drive. On the other hand, I had this sort of responsible Asian immigrant drive, which was, be studious. I was a professional student essentially. I went to like a good high school, went to a good college, went and got my graduate degree, and I thought I was going to be a professor for a while, in film, like film history and film theory. And so I think those two things sort of combine where I'm like analytical and critical. I use like critical thinking to like unpack how things are made, creatively. And then on the other hand, like I'm just really like jazzed by like great creative things. And I think as like at this point, like creative director, manager type, you kind of need to know how to do both. You need to be driven by the work, but you also need to know how to make the work, how to make the work better, what's failing on the work, all of that. And I think my background led me to this.
Yeah. So I want to unpack a couple of things. There's a lot you dropped in there. And the
Yeah.
first is growing up in the time we grew up, how did you get those little gigs, right? As a person of color, right? Entertainment
Mhm.
is one known. We'll talk about this later. We'll get into
Yeah.
how you had to evolve and the struggles you faced. But even as you mentioned in high school and college, how did you get those little gigs? You dropped Francis Ford Coppola. That's pretty.
Yeah.
You say that's a little gig. That's a big name if it was a little gig. But how did you find these? If people wanted to find these opportunities, like how did you do it?
Yeah. So, I mean, I will say, like, you know, having access to a network, is so critical. And I don't know if I always appreciated that early on, but reflecting and looking back, I'm realizing, I benefited from that. Okay. So my thing was like, I grew up in a probably like lower middle class family, you know. Uh, but because there was such an emphasis on like studies and academic achievement, I was pushed. I like to think I pushed myself, but it was really like my parents pushing me to like, I got into good schools, like for instance, in LA, like I went to this school called Harvard Westlake. If you're in LA, a lot of people know about it. And like, there's a lot of kids with like celebrity parents and folks in the industry. So like, I, it now I never used like anyone's parents to get in the industry, but the bar of entry seemed a little bit lower, right? Because it was like, oh, Timmy's dad, like, runs Sony Pictures or something. It was just like it felt a little more accessible. So by the time I got into college, uh, what happened was, and similarly, I got into a pretty good college that just kind of gives you the confidence to like, reach out and try things. Like at college, there an alum was like the casting director for David O. Russell. So I got a meeting with that person. And I didn't end up getting a job from that, but I had access. Um, and then what happened was I just sort of like cold called places like I think it was A&M Records, Capitol Records, Interscope with like, so I would sort of cold call, send email letters and like a link to some of my work, and I started getting like little internships and things like that. So there's sort of two things on this. One is like the network of influence around me, like I said, sort of made these things seem a little less intimidating, although I didn't like I literally I'm not like a nepo baby, or I never got that kind of access where someone like my best friend like put me on set in a film. But it was just like, okay, it was normalized, this is like what normal people can do. And then I just kind of used my own initiative, and a lot of it was sort of naivete as well, just like, okay, just gonna like reach out to this person and see if they need help. And that, so with the Francis Ford Coppola thing, what it was American Zoetrope. I was a huge fan of like Sofia Coppola. She had just done Virgin Suicides. And I just reached out to them and said, I'm a fan of the film. I'd love to like help out on whatever next project. And I ended up, you're not getting paid. They could definitely use like, young, hungry people wanting to, fetch coffees and stuff. And I was just that dude. I was running around doing like very grunt work PA stuff, but I got my foot in the door in terms of like, Francis Ford Coppola's company. Um,
Yeah.
I should also mention, you're going to probably want to edit this because I'm a little bit rambly, but I should also mention that I got sort of disenchanted as well. Like, you know, it's one thing to say I worked at like American Zoetrope. It's another to describe what was happening there. Like, it wasn't great. Like my experience there wasn't great. And like, um, I ended up, uh, going like questioning whether I really wanted to work my way up as a PA into like, a job there, because the work was so like, I mean, it sucked. It was like not intellectually challenging,
Mhm.
and on top of that, I think I was in an era when there was still a little bit of like bullying and stuff. There was just like, you have to pay your dues kind of attitude that, again, I was a little naive to it, and probably, I probably have had maybe an inflated sense of self. And I was like, I don't want to put up with this bullshit, you know. But
Yeah.
you know, that ultimately led me to try and figure out other pathways to getting into the creative work I wanted to do.
Yeah. So I mean that's a great story. I mean, it tells me three things, right? One was, maybe you didn't understand the value of your network, but there was value nonetheless, right, in creating a network and taking advantage of what you had. Um, and then the second thing was to not be afraid to ask, right? So you were cold calling, cold emailing, right? Like you were hustling essentially, right, to do what you want to do. And then three is, sometimes it may be for free, but if you want to take advantage, if you want your foot in the door, sometimes you're gonna have to do that. Now, maybe not in the bullying sense that you mentioned, right? But be
Yeah.
willing to learn, right? Because that's one thing I think this I don't want to say it's a generational thing, but as generations come along, there's less willing to do whatever it takes, right? I think we come from a generation where you're almost willing to do whatever it takes just to see what it's like and also to give you the access. Now, you shouldn't be bullied, you shouldn't be like belittled and all those things, but there's still something to be said about gaining that experience and understanding what it takes.
I think you're 100% right. And I think I and we could probably talk at length about this this notion of you know, sort of generational differences and attitudes towards work. But I will say um, the thing that helped me the most, I think, was that I just worked really hard, especially in those early parts of your career. You kind of don't know what the rules are. You don't know if this level is the level you need to hit for your job. It's sort of uncapped. You're just like, okay, I'm going to do whatever it takes to get the work done. And also just for me to get my name out there, but most importantly, for me to just learn more. The more you work, the more you're just learning your craft, your skills, but also what all the other, you know, uh, you know, partner, cross-functional partners, disciplines, what they're doing as well. And the more you know about what their needs are and how they operate, it just all helps you, in your career. So while I think, and I don't want to make this too sticky a point. While I think there is tremendous historical abuse and disadvantages of power and and all that, that's certainly the case. That doesn't mean that that should be your only focus. Even within the you know domain that you can kind of control, you need to work your hardest, to kind of maximize the potential of a project, your own potential. And so hard work is still the baseline. And then of course, if you have passion to make more radical change within the industry, which is stuff that I'm a little more turned on to now. I think, that that can happen as well. But like I said, sometimes those structural issues are just so hard to deal with, and
Hmm.
they can really bring you down and just kind of paralyze you. So you need to find something that you still build your muscle on, which is working on stuff you can control.
Yeah. What keeps you going now? Right. So that was like earlier in the career, right? You're building your career, right? You're trying to, like you mentioned, you're making a name for yourself. You're trying to establish yourself. So what keeps you going now? What is it that makes you why do you do what you do?
There's a whole slew of reasons. It's not a singular thing. Uh, but at its core is I think the job of a creative person, period, is to get a better understanding of themselves, you know, and it's this sort of long journey of understanding who you are and kind of how you want to appear and express yourself to the world, and I think that that's, again, I haven't always identified that, and again, due to sort of like a lot of my upbringing, the immigrant responsibility thing, like I never like admitted to myself that I wanted to be a creative, you know, but now I understand that that's probably the thing that like brings me the most joy, is just to like be creative, be around creative people, the process of thinking of ideas, crafting them, being on set, on production, working in Photoshop to just noodle details, like all of that stuff is stuff that like makes me happy, and I like being around other people that like to do that stuff. So I think that's the thing. Within that, those are a lot of the things that make make me still keep me motivated. It's sort of internal, but it's also external. Like I like working with teams. I like being inspired by other people, and then I like, this is very specific to, I think, like advertising, which I think operates sort of similar to like film production, which is probably the thing I know best. Like film
Mhm.
is like my biggest passion. And so that idea of like having there's like a director, with the vision, but everyone else is plugging in and adding to that thing. That team atmosphere is like I'm really inspired by that. You know.
Nice. So I want to pivot a little bit and get into how you kind of came up because you have a unique background in where you went from agency to client, from large to small to everything in between through acquisition. You've experienced a lot of things in your career.
Yeah.
So, what was it like to go? Let's start with just the first. What was it like to go from smaller shops then having to transition into these larger tech entertainment type businesses?
Yeah. So, you know, uh, broad strokes, you can kind of compare like creative agencies versus like, in-house or client side jobs, right? Like that's probably the core thing. But what's funny is like even within the agency world, there's a massive range between like boutique creative driven
Right.
shops to like, if you work on pharma at a big ad agency, that might, look quite different. So I think I was like fortunate in I had some stints at like large networky agencies where it was a bit of a grind, but where I think I found my voice and where I found like the greatest sense of like joy around the job was at these more creatively driven places. And but that said, almost universally, like at creative agencies, creative is king, right? Like creative determines, makes all the decisions, and you have a whole sort of like, system in place to allow you to like try and, kind of be the best creative you can be. Now, again, there's people will say there's, you'll get bad feedback from client, blah, blah, blah. You get it. But overall, like when you compare like creative agencies to like client side, that's the main difference. Client side, creatives are like, you know, I think first and foremost, and sort of at like sort of nascent, sort of, especially on tech companies, like creative is seen as purely as a sort of functional service thing, right? Like all the ideas and stuff and the strategies are baked, within a group. It's usually like within product or something, and then like marketing is just like, okay, let's run a bunch of SEO ads, and you start with sort of the performance stuff and whatever. It's all very service oriented, and you don't have access to like as many strategic conversations, and that took some adjustment for me, and it's crazy because like at this point in my career and just given my background and everything, I love creative, but I always marry it with strategy, and to not be able to contribute in that way can be frustrating because you're often handed like really poor strategy,
Mhm.
and sort of bad ideas to execute. And I think when you're first in a client side job, you're not quite sure like, do I build like some equity and, some relationship equity by just like doing these like shitty jobs, like these nonsensical jobs, just to say I'm here and to help? Or do you try and like assert your, strategic will like earlier on? And that's a tricky thing. I honestly think like the relationship building thing needs to happen first. Like people just need to trust you and see you as like a willing partner. And then you'll earn your way to like, a seat at the table, quote unquote.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. Where creative is a way to often seen as a way to scale it first, right? Like, how do we create these
Mhm.
products? Yes, we need content and creative to be put into it, right? But yes, you build a relationship, but then the next thing you do is need to create a shared meaning of what good starts to look like, and
Yeah,
working with these partners in languages that they use to understand the importance of creative. Like, you just can't throw something into an experience and expect it to do well just
yeah,
because maybe it
yeah,
looks pretty, right? It has to be
yeah,
functional. So,
yeah.
like, we can probably go into the whole thing, but maybe you can give me your 2-minute version on this. Like, have you encountered that, and how have you created that shared understanding of what good creative looks like?
So I honestly think it needs to it's a two-way street, right? Like, so if there is like a very strong notion of what creative needs to be, even if it's a completely like misunderstood notion, it's just a wrong notion. um, you need someone at the very top with decision making power, with some appreciation for creative, or some like creative point of view. And sometimes I just say like they need taste. They need to have some taste. They need to want to put like work that just has some like craft to it. Like there's an understanding that like when you execute well on creative, it will impact the business positively. They need to
Mhm.
like fundamentally understand that. And um, my answer to that question is like I've never been able to do it alone. I am not like a single change agent person. I don't know if there are many people out there like that. And even if you have that sort of like creative guru status, I mean, you could be Rick Rubin and walk into some of these companies, and like you will have no ability to persuade people, unless there's someone at the top going, "Oh yeah, like Rick Rubin knows what the fuck he's talking about, and we should listen to some of his ideas." So for me, um, one thing is, during like the interview process and stuff, during the whole like, interrogation period between company and you and company, you need to find out if there is going to be like a support network for you and your ideas, you know. And then once you get in, you really start trying to build on that, you know.
Mhm.
And then, companies are huge. Like I said, one person can't do anything on their own. What you need to do is you need to find other people that are aligned with you, or you convince them to get aligned with like your vision, and you just start taking steps towards getting to that place. Yeah,
Right. Yeah, you go farther together. Absolutely.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
so going back a little bit, and we talked about this a little bit in the pre-show, is you know, obvious this for this podcast too, you're a person of color, and navigating through this, what are some of the struggles and maybe advice you have for folks trying to navigate this kind of career, this kind of professional
yeah.
life?
Oh my god, this is like a whole separate podcast, dude. I'm serious.
It
We
is.
might we
Well,
might want to do like an episode too, because this is it. It's complicated and weird, and there are like things you admit that don't always sound nice. It's a funky conversation, but I'll say this. You know, I would say probably, during the pandemic and post pandemic, obviously there's been more awareness around this like deficiency, and as a result, people of color have had more opportunities, at some of these like senior jobs. I feel like there was a period, and by the way, I think it's like waning now. I think it's going down. There's something about tenor of the political climate and all this, maybe
Mhm.
it's sort of reverse trend as well. But for a while there, and I was hearing this from like a lot of my, especially like white male counterparts, is like, oh my god, like you have so much more access to these jobs than I do. You know, this is me with the white man hat on. And and it's kind of a weird thing to hear and talk about, but I acknowledge that. Like there has been a moment, like I said, I think it's going, it's slipping away a little bit, but I think overall there was an attempt to make leadership more diverse. And it does a couple things. One is like it just makes, as a person of color, you're aware of it, and then you get all these weird feelings around, should I be like taking advantage of this? Like should I be buying into this thing and taking advantage of it, or whatever thing, whatever psychological thing might be happening, like put that all aside, and I'll just say like, okay, well, if I'm getting access to these like interviews and roles and stuff, like I'm gonna just present my best self, and try and get these jobs because I think I can do as good a job as anyone else. It also made me go like, I do feel like there is like a network, and again, so I think a lot of this is unconscious, but I think there's just a network of like sort of tribalism or whatever you want to call it, where you just hire someone like you know? And
Mhm.
so I was like, oh, have I been a victim of that? And so anyway, when I had the chance to sort of like design teams and orgs the way I wanted to, I was just like, I just wanted to look more places, than like existing, you know, recruitment pipelines and stuff. You just have to look everywhere, and then on top of that, um, I just try to engage in more conversations with other creative folks of color and just get an understanding of like what has your experience been. And it's funny, there's like this underlying hum um what acknowledgement, that like shit's a little bit different for us, but like if we're given like an opportunity, let's like all try to maximize this together, and make work that's meaningful. Okay. And then the last thing, I'm sorry I'm rambling so much, but the last thing I want to say on this is um I think like I found a lot of satisfaction in having my own personal experience sort of manifest itself in the work, you know? And it could be like an immigrant story, it could be being Asian, it could be like, it could be like my interest in pop culture, which maybe transcends sort of like these identity things. But the point is like, um, no matter what makes for the strongest creatives uh, you know, is uniqueness. And the only way you can be unique is when you're yourself, right? So
Mhm.
that ultimately means like your whole being and identity and the way you were raised and the cultural values and all that, that ends up sort of spilling into the work. And when you have more diversity, you just kind of see like, you see more points of view, and then on top of that, this is the other interesting thing I've noticed is like, you would think, if it's a story that you haven't experienced yourself, it might be like, oh, this is strange or weird. The more specific and unique the story, the more universal it becomes, and the more sort of permission I think people feel uh, to like express their own unique stories. Like that's the takeaway. It's not like, oh, this weird little story about, you know, this country's kid and, going through poverty. It's not like I can't relate to that completely, but I can relate to someone having an experience and having the gumption and wherewithal and like hustle to like find support to tell that story, and the means to do that, to me, is like that's what's inspiring.
Yeah, I mean, I love that perspective, and I even, going back to, that should I be taking advantage of this or not? And I think the pendulum has swung maybe too far, right? And where my perspective is you open up your candidate pool, not necessarily like you have to hire to a quota, right? And so for
Yeah.
me, when I was doing like building this team at Netflix, it was less about, oh, I'm going to hire this minority, that minority, this minority, that. It was less about that and more like I want to at least talk to people that come from different backgrounds, different, and see
Yeah.
what they have to offer, and then find the best candidate from there. And there, in my team, there, I had someone from Microsoft, someone from advertising, the Coca-Cola, the person who led production at Coca-Cola. Like it was far, like they were from way different backgrounds and just the right people for the jobs, but that made us that much more creative and more effective as a leadership team because we had like so many perspectives represented. And I think that's where people get it wrong, whereas they think they have to hit this number and like, oh, we need 50% minority leaders represent or whatever. If you open up your candidate pool just by nature of and then truly hire the best person, just by nature, you should make your workforce diverse, right? And so that's where I think that it's
Yeah.
a little icky. Should I be taking advantage of this, or like the white person you said saying, "Oh, you have more access to things"? No, we just have fair access to things now, right?
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think you're right on that. I mean, any quota system feels a bit artificial, and there's now, a lot of work around, sort of questioning the quota based systems and stuff. But I think it's a couple things. One, like you said, you just have to widen your aperture, right? You just have to look at more people, with different backgrounds. And then I think the other thing is just asking the right questions and just digging into work a little bit more, because I think there are some folks like underserved communities, etc., where like maybe some of their potential isn't immediately evident on paper. Like they didn't go to the right schools and go to the right have the right companies. But if you look closely at the work, or you hear them talking about how they, you know, came up with the work, and sometimes it's just like looking at more personal projects and stuff, you go,
Hmm.
oh my God, like that's the stuff that you should be really doing, and that's again speaks to like the most creative people are the ones that are able to sort of insert some of their personality into the stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, there. Um, Whoopi Winger, who I had on here, it was his personal portfolio. He didn't go to college. He didn't do all those things, but his personal portfolio is what convinced me. And we almost didn't get into it because he was going through over stuff he showed me from like Snap and stuff.
Oh yeah.
Um, so yeah, like that, it's right on. And one of the things that it's a pet peeve of mine is people will say, "Oh, I'm going to take a bet on this person." Well, I'm like, "You're gonna take a bet on this person?" And
Yeah.
usually it was the underserved community. I'm like, how much harder was it for them to get in front of you than this other like part of the majority went to this like prestigious school, all this stuff, access to internships? How much harder was it for them to get here? Right? That shows me
Yeah.
more about that person. So
Yeah.
is that really a bet that they had to work for as far as they got, whereas this other person had the privilege maybe to go to these good schools, get all this stuff?
You're totally right. It's like, i- if they even got to the place where their resume is on your desk, that means like from where they're coming from, that means there's an incredible amount of hustle, ambition, already there. And I think you're totally right.
Yeah. So I know we're coming up on time, but I want to ask one thing. If you
Yeah.
could give your younger self some advice, what would it be?
I think you sent this question over to me. And I immediately wrote something very simple, a very long preamble to a very simple statement, which is don't overthink things. It's okay to make mistakes. That's the biggest thing. Like, and I try to tell that to, you know, all my creatives, like creatives are all racked with, you know, terrible insecurity, right? And like, oh, and the best creatives are always second guessing themselves. The work is never good enough and all that. And I think once you just give yourself permission to fail, and I know it's sort of a popular word in tech companies and stuff, but the reality is like most places hate failure, and so many of these folks are like Harvard, Stanford Business School, like all they've only had a history of achievement. And I think the most interesting people are the ones that fuck up and fail a shit ton of times. And it, makes your skin thicker. You've experienced more things. You've experienced a wider range of emotions, and you're able to handle everything a lot better when you've tried a lot of things, you failed a bunch of times, and then the successes are like better earned as a result.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, creatives were always, we have this perfectionist mentality and we know it doesn't exist, but yet we still kind of pursue it, and anything less isn't worth showing, right?
Yeah.
Even people that say, "Hey, can you show your whip?" Nope. I'm not gonna show
Yeah.
my work in progress unless it's like 90% of the way there, which, yeah, to your point, just put it out there. My perspective is the sooner you get feedback, the better it'll be,
Yeah.
right? So yeah, make
Yeah.
mistakes.
Yeah,
Um,
well, especially with the trusted network. I understand, like, you don't want to, be flailing out there naked under the most, like, you know, you know, critical eye. But again, this was another point I wanted to make earlier. But like, you know, all you need are like 4 to 6 people around you, that can be like advisors, a support group, like if you find that little squad, and you can find that at a small agency or a big company, just find some like-minded people that can give you that confidence and like very clear criticism to make you better. That's the other thing I would say is find that small little crew that can help you.
yeah, absolutely. Well, I know we're at time. I know you gotta get going. But yeah, if people want to get in touch with you, I'll drop the links in the show notes. We'll get your LinkedIn, whatever else you want to share. Is there any last words you want to give before we sign off?
I feel like I could blab on more and more. So, like, if you ever want to like chat more, I'm happy to do that. But otherwise, yeah, I'll leave some of my info and just say like, don't be scared to fuck up. Like that's part of the job and that's part of the fun. And your career is really not made by like your failures and wins. It's your personality, your relationships, and the effect you have on people.
Yeah, great advice. I don't know anyone who's done anything who hasn't failed at some point in time. All right. Well, yeah, we definitely got to have you on again. So thanks, David, for joining us. This is Creative Leadership with Heart. See you all. Thanks for joining us. We'll check you out next one. Thanks for listening to this episode of Creative Leadership with Heart. If you enjoyed the show, please like and subscribe. If you're ready to make huge, lasting change in your life, then what are you waiting for? What will your life look like if you took action today? What would it look like if you didn't? If you're serious and you're ready, book your free strategy session today and let's make your future a reality.